My name is Gregg Ivers, and I'm a professor of government in the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. And welcome to the third chapter of my ongoing series on hidden civil rights history in the Washington, D.C. area. It is a picture-perfect mid-October Saturday morning here in the nation's capital. Behind me is a stunning view of Rock Creek Park, which runs through the heart of Northwest Washington. I'm standing on the Calvert Street Bridge, which links two popular neighborhoods in D.C., Adams Morgan to my east and Woodley Park to my west. More than one college student, well, let's be honest about this, really anyone still young enough to have a good time has stumbled across this bridge after an evening of cultural exploration. In what direction, I can't really say. The odds are that most people walking, driving, stumbling, and even crawling across this bridge have probably never noticed the dedication on the bridge where I'm now standing. Google Maps might list this bridge as the Calvert Street Bridge, but for many DC residents, it's better known as the Duke Ellington Memorial Bridge. Duke Ellington is one of the most important figures in the history of American music, and not just jazz, which, ironically, was a label he never accepted as properly descriptive of his music. Ellington described his music as beyond category, which is a far more accurate representation of his work. But we are not here this morning to discuss the musical legacy of Duke Ellington. Rather, we're here to talk about another important but often overlooked part of this Washington, D.C. native's life and career, his contribution to the African American civil rights movement. Edward Kennedy Ellington was born on April 29, 1899, in the home of his maternal grandparents on what was then 2129 Ida Place, now 2121 Ward Place, in the D.C. neighborhood known as the West End. And no, Ellington was not born in the parking garage of this rather nondescript office building you see on my left, which now houses a post office. Back then, the West End was a vibrant African-American community, and closer to street level, you can see this commemorative plaque honoring the Ellington birth home. Ellington spent his youth in D.C., moving with his family to 5 other houses, mostly in the neighborhood known here as Shaw. This house, located at 1805 13th Street Northwest, is part of the D.C. African American Heritage Trail, and you'll see this plaque when you walk by. By 1917, Ellington, who had dropped out of high school just 3 months short of his graduation to pursue his interests in music, was earning enough money playing gigs in and around D.C. to move out of his parents' home and buy this house at 2728 Sherman Avenue Northwest in the neighborhood now known as Columbia Heights. The Sherman Avenue house was his last D.C. residence before moving to New York in 1923, just as the Harlem Renaissance was in full bloom. Ellington would take up residence in Harlem, where, when he was not leading his band around the country and the rest of the world, he would live for the remainder of his life. Ellington established himself as a composer and band leader of note shortly after arriving in New York. By 1927, his star was shining bright enough to land him a 3.5-year residency at the Cotton Club, perhaps the most famous and notorious nightclub in Harlem, and for that matter, all of New York. Famous because it attracted the most accomplished black talent in the city, notorious because the club was a mob front, decorated in a plantation theme to provide its whites-only patrons with what promoters called an authentic jungle music experience. The performers were all black and were not permitted to mingle with the audience unless specifically invited to do so. Waiters in attendance, all of whom were black, were often required to dress as exotic savages and plantation residents to further appease their white customers. The Cotton Club didn't just degrade Harlem nightlife. It reinforced the stereotypes of black Americans that writers, artists, and musicians who were part of the Harlem Renaissance, such as James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Elaine Locke, Zora Neale Hurston, and yes, Duke Ellington, were countering by presenting the reality of African American cultural life. One of the great ironies of Ellington's time at the Cotton Club was that it produced Black and Tan Fantasy, his first major composition that sought to communicate the black American experience through tone, mood, and form. In less than 3 minutes, Ellington offers a remarkably distinctive blend of secular and religious elements of black American culture. From the blues-infused growls and bended notes that open the song, to the dirge tempo quoting Chopin's funeral march that brings the composition home, Ellington turns the idea of jungle music on its head. Black and Tan Fantasy would become the first of many of his compositions that, to paraphrase Ellington, communicated through music what he could not say openly. By the end of his Cotton Club run, Duke Ellington had become a national figure, in large part due to weekly radio broadcasts by NBC and CBS that were carried by local affiliates all over the country. In December 1932, a local African American attorney by the name of Pat Patterson approached members of New York's jazz world to consider having them stage a benefit concert for the Scottsboro Boys. Ellington's star power put him at the top of a list that included Benny Carter, Fletcher Henderson, Ethel Waters, and the great Harlem Stride pianist Fats Waller. Ellington agreed to participate in this historic benefit at the Rockland Palace, which was located in Harlem. This marked the first time that black artists had publicly come to the defense of a civil rights cause. And when you consider that the Scottsboro Boys case involved 9 young black men between the ages of 13 and 19 falsely accused of raping 2 white women in the Deep South, for Ellington to lend his name for such a benefit was a pretty damn big deal. Benefit concerts would become an important part of Ellington's work on behalf of the civil rights movement for the remainder of his career. He never hesitated to donate his time, or that of his band, to organizations and causes he believed in. He raised countless amounts of money for the NAACP. In fact, he was one of its foremost fundraisers in the 1950s and 1960s. He also staged concerts on behalf of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress of Racial Equality, labor unions, youth education programs, really anything he thought would advance the Black American freedom movement. And in the category of no good deed goes unpunished, the FBI began opening files on numerous jazz musicians, artists, and other performers that it felt were engaging in subversive activities. Ellington was one of those. You can see right over my shoulder the cover of Duke Ellington's FBI file, and this is the actual file itself. And I would love to tell you there's all kinds of interesting stuff in here, but there really isn't. And most of it's redacted. In other words, you can't even see what they're so concerned about. But a lot of what's in here is simply a diary, where he played, the organizations that asked him to play for them, things like that. There's really nothing here. But what it does illustrate is the risk that jazz musicians, particularly black jazz musicians like Duke Ellington, took when they decided to lend their support to a cause they really believed in. Music, though, remained the primary medium through which Ellington sought to communicate his message, and in 1941, he premiered his most ambitious piece of work to date to celebrate the African American cultural tradition. Jump for Joy featured an all-black 60-member cast, and in Ellington's words, was designed to take Uncle Tom out of the theater and make his audiences think. It was also notable for Ellington's unusually direct use of lyrics to communicate themes involving race. 3 songs stand out. The first, Jump for Joy. Fare thee well, land of cotton, Cotton Isle is out of style. The next one, Same Old South. It's a regular children's heaven where they don't start work until they're 7. And then finally, I got a passport from Georgia, and I'm going to the USA. Goodbye, Jim, and I do mean Crow. Many years later, when Ellington was confronted by younger musicians or civil rights activists with the question, when are you going to write something that supports our movement? Ellington would always respond, I did, 20 years ago, and it was called Jump for Joy. 2 years later, Ellington composed an even more ambitious work, Black, Brown, and Beige, a 3-part panoramic orchestral suite that was, in his own words, a tone parallel to the history of the American Negro. Black, Brown, and Beige premiered at Carnegie Hall in New York, and in true Ellingtonian fashion, the suite not only fused Negro spirituals and the blues to tell the story of black pain, it incorporated the powerful, joyous, and distinctive rhythms that made Ellington's approach to big band swing uniquely his own. Black, Brown, and Beige represents the pinnacle of Ellington's approach to protest music. He used metaphor and tone parallels to express the range of the Black American experience. Toward the end of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, jazz musicians such as Max Roach, Jackie McLean, Charles Mingus, and Sonny Rollins, all of whom would acknowledge their debt to Ellington, released landmark recordings that addressed the Black freedom struggle in much more explicit terms. Ellington believed that artistic excellence, carrying himself with grace and class, and never allowing those who sought to diminish his humanity or that of his people were the best weapons in the fight for social justice. Duke Ellington passed away on May 24, 1974 in New York City. He's buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, a final resting place that includes 2 other seminal figures in the history of American music, Miles Davis and Ornette Coleman. Although he spent almost 50 of his 75 years in New York, Washington, D.C. will always consider Duke Ellington one of its favorite children. Yes, Ellington's musical legacy remains everywhere in this city, but it is also essential to remember the special contribution that this peerless composer and musical magician made to the African American civil rights movement. I hope you've enjoyed the third in this series on hidden civil rights history in the Washington, D.C. area, and I hope you've learned something as well.